Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to the latest installment in the Black Hat webcast series. Today's event is titled 2013, the Infosec Year in Review, brought to you by Black Hat, RSA, and United Business Media. I'm Steve Paul with Black Hat, and I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, and later in the program we will ask for your feedback. There is no dial-in required. You're participating in listen-only mode, where slides will be automatically synchronized with the audio from your computer speakers. If you are calling in, please remember to dial your access code and PIN required, and please close out of all unnecessary applications and disable your pop-up blockers. We strongly encourage participation and are happy to take your questions and comments. You can participate in our Q&A session by asking questions at any time. Simply type your question into the text box located at the bottom right of your screen. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation will be able to be found on the Black Hat website in the next day or so. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please refer to the help link in the upper right-hand corner of your console. And now on to our presentation, 2013, the Infosec Year in Review. Discussing today's presentation will be first our guest presenter, Haroon Mir, founder of Thinkst. And then after Haroon, we will have our sponsor presenter, Amit Yaran, Senior Vice President, Unified Products with RSA, the Security Division of EMC. So as we get started, we'd like to first turn over control to Haroon. And so, Haroon, here you go.
And I think we should be good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for dialing in or joining us. Webcasts are a little strange just because we don't get to see immediate feedback. So if you guys start throwing angry questions at the chat room, I'll know that I'm doing something horribly wrong. So really quickly, what we're aiming for is 2013, the year in review. And I guess like all slides, we're going to have to start with who we are and why it matters. So essentially, the presentation's put together by Marco Slaviero and myself. And both of us are from South Africa. South Africa, most people know because of legends like Nelson Mandela at the top corner of the screen, and more recently, are known for the fake interpreter who actually showed up at his memorial service and repeated a small subset of hand signals for the entire service. So I guess South Africans span a pretty wide spectrum. But in terms of information security, I assure you Marco and myself have never done any public translating. For the most part, what we've done is a lot of security research. So we've been speaking at Black Hat since about 2001, publish a whole bunch of stuff from shell scripts to shell code. And one of the things that we do is run a service where we actually keep people up to date with research in the industry. And it's kind of what we're going to try to go through here today. We're trying to go through some of the updates. So 2013, by any standards, 2013 was super eventful. And if you think about it, you're trying to compress about 8,800 hours into one. And that's a better compression ratio than even gzip would give you. So it's bound to be slightly lossy. And so what we're going to try to do is obviously not cover absolutely everything. We're going to try to break this up into significant events that happened in 2013, some research themes that we saw, and then some future themes if we've got time for it. Just so you guys know, right at the end of the slides, we've got a list of links to all the slides and all the articles that we cover. So you don't have to scramble to take any of them down now. The slides will be available and all those links will be available for you just after that. So kicking off the year, we started January 30th. We started really early with what could only be titled, "Oh my God, China." So there was a big push early on in the year about Chinese hackers attacking the planet. And it was kind of the first signs of it came through late in January when New York Times came out and published the fact that they've been hacked, and they were tracking hackers for at least the last 4 months. And they had hired this firm. They had hired a well-known firm called Mandiant, and Mandiant had been investigating these attackers. And shortly thereafter, like in early Feb, Washington Post came forward and said they were hacked by the Chinese. Bloomberg came out and said they were hacked by the Chinese. The Wall Street Journal came out and said they were hacked by the Chinese. It was starting to get to the point where if you were a reputable news agency and you didn't say you were hacked by the Chinese, then it would have raised all kinds of questions. And so shortly thereafter, Mandiant published a document called APT1. Okay, and it's had 3 broad sections. Basically said, look, they've discovered the existence of this Chinese brigade unit 61398, and they've been tracking this group called APT1. And the obvious conclusion was that APT1 was the Chinese unit. But what's more interesting already at the outset is that the Mandiant report didn't exist in a vacuum. If you look at it in order, essentially what happened was all those guys came out saying they were hacked, and Mandiant came out with this report a few days later. And a few days after that, the White House issued a report on a strategy for reducing the theft of U.S. trade secrets in cyberspace. And in what seems amusing in a life post-Snowden, Hillary Clinton made a statement that said a global effort was needed to establish rules for cyber activity. So at this point, the report came out and it got lots and lots of press. And essentially the aim of the report, or the crux of the report, was relatively simple. Like I said, it says that Unit 61398 is the military unit responsible for intelligence and signals intelligence. That there's this group of operators called APT1, and they go a little bit into detail on their tools, tactics, and procedures. And then the obvious conclusion they jumped to was that the 2 guys are exactly the same. So we had 2 responses to the piece at the time. The first one was a kind of fuzzy general piece. It was an opinion piece that we put out, which basically went down the list and said, look, lots of guys are doing this cyber espionage stuff. And we questioned why it suddenly, everyone's gaze was turning to China. And we put a few theories out there, some simple ones being a whole bunch of new players have entered the space recently. So they used to talk about the military-industrial complex, and what we've been seeing over the last few years is very clearly the rise of a military-digital complex. And pretty much the same guys who've been running around selling missiles and stealth fighters for a while have now figured out that they can make just as much money selling exploits and things related to cybers. And so there's this huge hawk movement that needed a good enemy. And one of the things you noticed from the proposed how to run in cyberspace document that came out from the Obama administration was that they very quickly mentioned that they were going for enhanced domestic law enforcement operations and improved legislations as 2 of the 5 key strategic items, which kind of gives you a hint where this whole Chinese boogeyman thing was going. We get shown a new enemy, and immediately we get told why we need new law enforcement. And we've seen that movie before, and we kind of know where it goes. Marco released a Thingscapes ad hoc update on it and was actually a lot more scientific about it. And he goes through a bunch of reasons why the initial report was flawed. But probably one of the biggest things that he puts out is that while this report is portrayed as conclusive evidence of espionage, it doesn't quite meet the bar for a scientifically verifiable document. And he goes through a list of reasons why the initial points that were made don't quite hold water. And some of them are really simple with just a little bit of thought. So one of the big highlights in the document was that the attackers were traced to a location in Pudong where we know that that Chinese unit operates. But one of the things that don't come out is that that area is roughly the size of Los Angeles with 5 million people. It would be roughly the equivalent of blaming any attack that takes place in Los Angeles on a military unit that clearly resides therein. So moving on from that quickly, we thought, while the Mandiant report was really well known and everyone was talking about it, another hack happened shortly thereafter that very few people spoke about. And we thought it was interesting. Essentially, the Nmap project was kind of compromised. And so if people were downloading Nmap during that time, chances are they were downloading, or they were possibly downloading binaries that had been altered. And the story behind the attack is even more interesting if you actually dig into it. So essentially, there's this old school hacker group called Hack the Planet. Okay, and they put out these zines periodically where they literally hack the planet. So they go after people, hack them, embarrass them, that sort of stuff. And at some point, Hack the Planet turned their aim at MIT. And in part, or the general reasoning seems to be that they aimed at MIT in an act of one-upmanship against Anonymous. And at the time, they essentially compromised MIT's DNS and stole about 5 gigs of their email. And then they hunted down some of their competition and found that they were using Swift IRC. So they were using the Swift IRC network. And Swift IRC has servers on Linode, who is a popular VPS provider. So the guys at HTTP decided to go after Linode in order to compromise Swift IRC, in order to compromise their competition. And to take it a step further, Linode hosts their DNS with name.com, and so name.com became fair game for the HTTP crowd. They actually did manage to compromise the account at name.com, so they had a whole bunch of DNS names that they could attack. But while they were doing that, they managed to compromise Linode itself through an old web application. And using that, they were able to spread their influence. So they were able to access the box that hosts Nmap, the box that hosts Wireshark, Security, Hack5, and incidentally, even the machine that I stole IRC of. So there were a few things that were actually interesting from that attack, and a few lessons that we thought were worth learning. The one is the rational actor myth. Most days when companies try to figure out who they're likely to be attacked by, you kind of think things through logically. But if you were thinking things through logically, you would not have seen this HTTP attack coming in a month of Sundays. And it's maybe something we need to start factoring into our plans, the possibility of chaotic actors. And in this case, it should be a perfect nightmare, right? They're skilled, patient, determined, but chaotic. There was no reason for them to aim at you, but they did. And the second thing that we thought was interesting was the attack showed a great amount of determination and patience. And we've kind of been spoiled recently because people have these quick attack, quick results things. So you see a cross-site scripting attack or you see a SQL injection attack. And in this case, the attack was pretty old school and determined. Like even once they take DNS, they need time to cultivate usernames and passwords. They were taking time to spread their influence. It pretty much matches the definition of advanced persistent threat, although that's not how we use the term these days. And what's interesting is that an attack like that is not going to be mimicked if you pay some consultant to give you a 2-week security assessment. It's the sort of thing that needs time and won't show up any other way. So really quickly, the other thing that was interesting from the incident was their incident response plans. Linode were just terrible at it. So they made some dreadful mistakes which ended up with their washing getting shown to the public. And I think it's true for most people that most times the first time that they're really dealing with an incident is when the incident happens. And it's one of those times when I think the old adage holds, and you want to make sure that you sweat in training so that you don't bleed on the battlefield. In terms of detection, something that comes up often in our Thinkscapes reports, the MIT's DNS was changed, 5 gigs of their email was diverted, and nobody noticed until things were completely broken. And the question is whether you would notice if something like this was happening at your organization. In terms of supply chain problems, I guess it's a poster child for it. During that time, if you downloaded Nmap, you could have been downloading something evil. Nmap were trusting Linode, who got them into trouble. Linode were trusting name.com, which got them into trouble. And again, if you look at the amount of trust that we put into third-party players at our organizations today, you'll see we've got very few reasons to sleep well. The next big incident that happened during the year was this one. And like Snowden pretty much dominates. If you listen to anyone else doing a year-end review, they pretty much spend all their time talking about Snowden because it's certainly worth talking about. The first Snowden story popped out around June the 5th, which was basically about the NSA collecting Verizon phone records. And on the 6th, they dropped news of PRISM, some mass system where data was being collected from a bunch of providers. And what's interesting is the way the revelations came through. Initially, people flat out denied them, and then there were questions about the wording. And as time went on, more and more people started figuring out how much of this had at least grains of truth on it. And then it got harder and harder to deny. And so by the 8th, there was Boundless Informant. And by June the 9th, Snowden revealed himself to be the leak. And so there were a bunch of other leaks, and we'll touch on a few of them. But before we go into all of the leaks, something that I think is interesting is for us to look at some of the stuff that we could have learned even just from the Snowden leak itself. And the first one is how many security experts immediately dismissed the leaks. So they either said, look, this is not surprising, we know all of this stuff, or they came out and said, look, it's not important. Okay, and in retrospect, I think today everyone would say that there's at least something in here that we were not aware of. The second one is something that I've been talking about for a few years now, which basically is a problem that for the most part we've been ignoring. And the story that I often like to quote on this is that we as a society haven't figured out yet this new computer stuff. So in the old days, if somebody knew where all the company's secrets were, we basically promoted them and paid them more so that they wouldn't take the company down. And increasingly, the problem you have is that sysadmins and DBAs who are on next to minimum wage have access to the same secrets that traditionally CEOs had. And it's a hard problem to resolve. And it's one that we need to figure out. So the NSA have now swapped to a two-man rule. And I guess it's easier for those guys. I mean, they've been doing stuff like that in the military for a while. But it's an interesting problem for CISOs the world over. And Assange, Julian Assange from WikiLeaks, was fond of saying that courage is contagious. Basically saying that once a few people leak, more people will leak. And I'm not sure, because that kind of appeals to the nobility in man, so I'm not sure if courage is truly contagious that way. But what I do know is that post-WikiLeaks and post-Snowden, more people are aware of the possibility of leaking, which means even if previously they didn't know what they could do, increasingly you're going to see more and more of this pop up. So the other two quick things that were interesting there was figuring out that even the NSA haven't got the USB problem under control, which on the one hand makes you feel a little okay, but on the other hand makes you realize how hopeless it is. And I suspect most organizations don't have it sorted out. The last thing that was interesting was what this means for US-centric cloud services. We've already seen significant kickback on this. A few years ago, we did a talk at Black Hat on clobbering the cloud. And one of the things that we noted already was the fact that if our data was sitting in US cloud providers, we had zero right to protection. And if there's one thing that the Snowden leaks have brought to the surface, it's how little protection foreigners have on US cloud services. And I think there's relatively solid signs that this is starting to kick back and hurt people. But the Snowden leaks kind of became the gift that keep on giving. When he first leaked, at first people said he didn't have anything, and then people said, look, he has 20,000 to 30,000 documents. And today the estimate is something at 1.7 million documents. And in terms of security, whether you like him or whether you don't like him, you can pretty much tell that most conversations are now either in a pre-Snowden world or anno Sweden or past Snowden. And lots of his stuff has some pretty far-reaching effects. If we look really simply at some of the stuff on the fringes, there was talk of his hosting provider, Lavabit, his mail hosting provider, that shut down rather than handing over SSL keys. And in the wake of that, we saw other providers like Silent Circle shut down their secure mail service. And it's an interesting portent, I think, of things to come. Up on the right there, you actually see Matthew Green, who's a professor of applied cryptology at Johns Hopkins University. And Matthew Green talks often about crypto topics and attacking crypto topics, and he'd been blogging on the crypto aspects of the Snowden leaks. And he was actually given almost a takedown notice, and he was told to take down his blog posts or to get legal help if he wanted to continue writing that sort of stuff. And what's interesting about it is that it's kind of the epitome of what's normally known as the chilling effect, right? And it's exactly where we don't want to go with this stuff. We don't want to get to the point where our academics are scared to speak out, lest they get a cease and desist letter, or lest it affect their run for their career. And right at the bottom, fresh off the press, just yesterday, it was announced that Brazil actually turned down a contract with Boeing and instead went with a European contractor. So that's something like 4.5 billion that didn't go to a US company. And one of the reasons being cited is the breakdown in trust. So I'm going to try not to spend too much time on the Snowden leaks. Most of these we expected. There was the Prism stuff, there was X-Keyscore, there's a whole bunch of stuff where you've got to wonder how the NSA were choosing their names, because some of them were awesome. Egotistical Giraffe was a personal favorite of mine. But other than those that we were expecting, there were some unexpected shows. So for example, one of the things that came out was the GCHQ, the British counterparts to the NSA, who hacked Belgacom, a private service provider. And we kind of expect signals intelligence guys to be passive, and you don't so much expect them to actually go out compromising third parties. And in this case, GCHQ basically used LinkedIn phishing attacks and Slashdot phishing attacks and took out Belgacom, which was super interesting. And the one that Matthew Green was actually talking about, the one that got him into trouble, was when the discussion came out that the NSA had actually deliberately weakened standards. And it's interesting for multiple reasons. One is because it brings into question the whole purpose of NIST. If NIST is there to enforce public standards, and if the NSA has undue influence over NIST, then we can't really rely on NIST standards anymore. But probably the other scary thing that came out was that the backdoor that the RSA had, that NSA had suggested in Dually C DRBG had actually been known and detected in 2007, but was still the default pseudo-random number generator in RSA's commercial crypto library. So there's a whole bunch of people asking a whole bunch of questions of RSA as well. And probably one of the last things that I want to touch on from the Snowden leaks, just because it was super interesting and one of the most recent to come through, was a program called Code Traveler. And Code Traveler was interesting because it basically showed that the NSA had access to cell phone location records all over the world. And what they did with it was awesomely clever. Essentially, they're able to pair cell phones. So you could say these two cell phones always travel together, or whenever this cell phone is switched off, that cell phone is switched on. And part of the reason I find it so interesting is that it's such an awesome big data problem. It clearly points to huge problems in GSM and huge problems in inter-country relationships for that sort of information. But just in terms of modeling the actual data and pulling this data out, it would have been a fun project to work on, despite your questions on whether it was acceptable or not. And it kind of sums up for me a whole bunch of what we saw from Snowden so far, which is some of these attacks were truly just technically impressive, ignoring any moral judgments on it. And it's kind of sad because what it means is that last year, LulzSec and Anonymous showed us that we really didn't know how to defend anything. And this year, the Snowden leaks basically showed us that we didn't really know how to attack anything either. And most of us who thought that we were really clever attackers, we were pretty much bush league compared to some of the attacks that the NSA were pulling off without getting caught pretty consistently. And then, just to show us that you don't have to be huge and state-sponsored to make an impact, mainly the guys from the Syrian Electronic Army made 2013 the year of the phishing attack. And really, it's a problem that we should have handled, but phishing was still amazingly effective against a whole bunch of players. It took the New York Times, it took the Associated Press, and I think by now most people know the story. When they took the Associated Press's Twitter account, they put out a tweet saying explosions in the White House, and for a brief while the stock market dipped, and that gave everyone the ability to put out this horrific headline of how hackers have managed to lose billions in the economy. But I think one of the hidden things that were interesting for me there was the realization that you actually have high-frequency trading bots that are slurping in Twitter feeds and actually making trading decisions based on these Twitter feeds. It's truly interesting, and it does constantly make me wonder what would happen if someone like Justin Bieber went on stage and said that show was the bomb, or something equally insane, just to see whether it actually manipulates the stock market. Truly interesting. Sadly, 2013, we also lost a few leading lights. So for just about anyone who knew Barnaby Jack, and I think that's most of the people in the industry, nobody had anything bad to say about him. Besides for the stunt hacking type stuff, so making an ATM spit out money on stage that he did, most people will know that he also published early Windows kernel attacks. Even his paper as Dark Spirit in Frack was something most of us cut our teeth on when learning Windows exploit development. Peter Zor, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. I don't know him personally, but I loved his book on antivirus research. And you won't find an antivirus researcher who doesn't say that he was truly one of the best. Cedric Blanchard, most people know him as Sid, passed away tragically in a skydiving accident, I believe. And yeah, I don't think there's much to say other than the fact that the industry and all of us are poorer for it. And so I think it's time to move on to the talks and the research trends instead of just the events. And one of the things we've been touching on a fair bit is just how many talks there are. If you look at this graph, one of the things that's interesting in terms of talk volume is that the graph's not cumulative. It's actually just that we keep adding more and more talks and more conferences every year. And 2013 is going to wrap up with close to 5,000 talks and nearly 160 events. And it's not just the number of talks that are going up, right? Like the first Black Hat had just a handful of speakers, and Black Hat in 2010 had a whole host of speakers. And so by any measure, more and more, we just have more and more talks happening at any given time. And if you do a quick breakdown of the talks that we had this year, sadly and predictably, APT comes out on top. So if we do a 3-gram breakdown of précis handed over for conferences over the year, you see that advanced persistent threat pretty much dominated. You do see, just getting a message to speed it up, so I'm going to try speaking even quicker. So you do see bug bounties show up there, which is interesting, and if we've got time, we'll try to touch on it in a little bit. So we've got a few themes that we want to go into. I'm going to start hitting them in order just because we don't have much time. And the first one that's interesting for me is the question of scale. And so under scale, the first talk that we've actually got was from Stephen Bellevin. And I'm not sure if we included this because of how clever it was or because of the chance to actually include something from Stephen Bellarmine. I mean, we grew up on both building internet firewalls. But Stephen basically went through a bunch of reasons calling us out on how we're doing security these days and saying that what generally happens is something gets recognized as best practice. It gets moved on to checklists, and then we never go back and check whether these threats or defenses still apply to us at all. And he makes some arguments for a whole bunch of checks that we're still doing that actually don't matter at all. But probably the most interesting thing from his talk for me was talking about flow rates. And essentially his contention here is that increasingly we're getting to the point where we'll have faster flow rates than we can do detection. And what he says is that if we get to this point, we're going to have to start sampling for detection. And the simple thing is that if we're just sampling, attackers will know how to work around this. It's an interesting problem and something that I think more people should be thinking about. I'm going to skip through this really quickly. Essentially, we had researchers here talking about using both static and dynamic analysis, but again, what they're moving to is not just detecting attacks anymore, but how to detect them faster and at scale. Interestingly, this year, we also saw port scanning come back. Okay, the guys at ZMAP released a paper and released a tool which basically allows you to scan through the entire internet space in 45 minutes. And Robert Graham from Infosec then dusted off some of his code to give us a port scanner that would scan through the address space in something like 6 minutes. Again, it's useful, it's interesting, and it starts to give you interesting thoughts on your defense mechanisms. Because if what you rely on for detection is actually the initial reconnaissance, you need to ponder that the people aren't doing reconnaissance now. They could just be looking up the internet on the database they saved when they scanned it last night. We did a talk, essentially called a talk about talks, just to get about as meta as you can go. And what we were trying to ascertain is whether conferences themselves scale. We see the numbers going up, and the question is whether we're actually learning stuff and whether we're focusing on the right stuff. And sadly, I think we all kind of already know the answer to that one. And for the most part, we ended that talk with a plea for researchers to start working more on stuff that matters and less on stuff that makes headlines. So really quickly, the next thing that we were looking at was devices. And when we talk about devices, essentially we're talking about ushering in the post-PC era and sensors. And in the first talk that we looked at, which was a talk called Daisho, Michael Osman quoted Joshua Wright's law, which basically says that security won't get better till the tools for the practical exploration are made available. And for the most part, you see a fair bunch of guys putting together these sorts of tools. So the guys who put together Daisho essentially built a device which is a pair of circuit boards that in the initial version allows you to basically get Wireshark captures of gigabit Ethernet, USB, HDMI, and RS-232. And the interesting thing with what they're doing is that you can add front ends to it easily. So on the cards, you should be able to get HDMI, you should be able to get a whole bunch of other stuff and snuff it in between. So from Travis Goodspeed, who brought us the awesome talk last year on packets in packets, he built a device called FaceDancer. And essentially, FaceDancer allows you to run USB devices with Python code. And so those guys with an attacker mindset should see where this is going. Where previously fuzzing USB or USB attacks were really difficult, it now moves this bar lower, and people can start pulling these attacks off with Travis's FaceDancer and some Python code. So we should see interesting stuff coming out of there. Just thrown in for good measure, Stephen Ridley and the guys put together what they called a USB condom, which kind of took the internet by storm. What it does is make sure that if you plug your phone into someone's machine, it only gets power and doesn't get data. And interestingly, Stephen Ridley has done a lot of uber smart stuff in his time, and this is the thing that actually made NBC News, Discovery News, and just about blew up the internet. So there was another talk, a continuation of last year's talk on aircraft hacking, again using ADS-B and ACARS. The jury is still out on how realistic these attacks are, but what is interesting is that they're certainly getting results. It's going to be an interesting space to look at. Instead of attacking aircrafts, a whole bunch of people this year decided to attack cars. Probably one of the most famous are Charlie Miller and Chris Velasek. And one of the things that's interesting, so they attacked a Prius and a Ford, I think it was, and most of their attacks were basically attacks on the CAN network, on the control area network. And so they were able to send a whole bunch of commands to the car, making the car think the doors were open, making the cars think that they needed rapid brakes and stuff like that. But there were actually a few more talks on car hacking during the year. And what's clear is that it's a space that attackers are now getting into. Charlie and Chris essentially opened up their tool chain to everyone. So we should see more interesting things come out here. Something that's worth noting is Charlie's research, the talk before that on Daisho, all of these were actually sponsored by Mudge's CFT program, the Cyber Fast Track program. And so clearly we actually saw good research coming out of that stuff. So I'm going to move even quicker and probably skip over some stuff just because we've got no time. Under exploitation, there were a bunch of talks that were reasonably interesting. We see Android getting the hell exploited out of it comparatively as a platform. But the talk that I really want to focus on here was Tom Ritter's talk for ISEC partners on de-anonymizing alt-anonymous messages. Mr. Ritter did awesome work. And basically, alt-anonymous messages was forged in the early 90s, so in the cyberpunk heydays. And through good, solid scientific work and using essentially metadata, Tom was able to de-anonymize lots and lots of those messages. And it's a scary reminder for us of how useful metadata is for the next time you hear someone say it's just metadata. There were some interesting stories, interesting work done on defense. I'm going to skip through the first one, which was basically a defense against the evil maid problem. The second one basically showed a way to use detect DNS tunnels through traffic, but the last two were really interesting for me. So Zane Lackey now works at Etsy, and he put together a talk on attack-oriented defense, and it deserves a prize just for making APT advanced persistent tapestries. But essentially what he did was said, look, traditionally we've been focusing on the perimeter, and we've dropped security products that don't address the problems anymore. And he kind of raised the same problems with pen testing that we raised for the last few years. And he essentially recommends changing this around, and this is what they're actively doing at Etsy. He says, look, what you want to do is raise the cost to attackers, increase the odds of detecting it, and then iterate. And he lists through a bunch of things that they are doing at Etsy to actually make this happen. A key thing that he points out is, if you're going to get pen testers in, get them in to say, how would a typical attacker break in? And then let's try to work out ways to defend against that. He's got a bunch of stuff. Interestingly, Etsy and the guys at Facebook put out some homespun tools to give you MAC detection and network detection. And some of it's genuinely interesting just because it's a fresh space and these guys are actually getting good results. The guys over at Twitter have been doing a talk called Building Phishing Antibodies, how they making anti-phishing training work at Twitter. It's super interesting, and essentially what they're doing is making sure they phish their staff repeatedly and often in a bunch of different ways, and then focusing on getting those numbers down for how many people click. And what the guys at Etsy actually mentioned was getting the numbers up of how many people actually report on this, which makes it a good time for completely shameless plug, because one of the things that we do is run a service that does the sort of anti-phishing campaigns. So if you've got time, go over to fish5.com and check it out. So other than this, the other thing that was really interesting, just as we wrap up, was the prevalence of bounty programs. Initially, lots of people were saying things against bounty programs, why they wouldn't work, why they'd be useless. And what we are seeing is definite results coming out of them. We've seen a startup launched this year called BugCrowd to manage outsourced bug bounties. And most interestingly, David Wagner and friends did an academic paper on an empirical study of vulnerability reward programs. And with a whole bunch of constraints, they effectively showed that for the cost of one security engineer, VRPs were turning out about 25% of all significant bugs. So we're down to the last few minutes. Really quickly, I'll blitz through some rising and falling trends that we've seen. Fortunately, BYOD hasn't become such a big conference trend. I don't think there's much into it. Hacktivism and Anonymous seem to have disappeared under the crushing weight of the attacks that we've seen possible from the NSA. One of the security researchers, the Gruk, did a talk on opsec a little while back, and one of his quotes was extremely pertinent, where he says, hackers are no longer the apex predator. And I think what's clear is that's true. There was no shortage of talks on mobile attacks this year, but sadly the quality wasn't as high as the quantity. And despite an early push making strike back hot early in the year because of largely CrowdStrike's opaque business model, we haven't seen much talk of that for the year. What we have seen on the increase is law enforcement hacks. We saw the shutting down of Silk Road. It's an interesting space. We saw the FBI going after Tor, actually using exploits to get to people who are hiding behind and anonymizing services. And we think it's an interesting space, and interesting stuff's going to come out of it. Big data sounds pretty lame, but we put it in there mainly because of what we're seeing through the NSA hacks and through stuff like that. OpSec's a heavily abused word these days. Almost everyone is talking OpSec, and I suspect next year we're going to see a whole bunch of people telling us what we should and shouldn't be doing. But Ben Nagy on Twitter had an interesting quote that said, those that know OpSec don't talk about it much, and those that talk about it much normally don't know. We've seen a few early pieces being done on drones. Sami Kamka, the guy who had built the Sami worm, just released a tool that allows you to hijack the AR drone. And it's largely a toy at this point, but we think that stuff's going to get bigger and bigger. We're seeing a lot of talks on attacking AV, not just bypassing them, where people are actually making sure that your security device is not a secure device. With all of the NSA hacks, we suspect there's going to be a bunch more people looking for privacy-enhancing solutions next year. And one of the things that I'm really pleased with is we're seeing a lot of homespun security stuff, which I think is largely good. I think big vendors can take you to a certain point, but the problem is that the attacker knows the space perfectly. And actually having clever people in-house doing some custom stuff gives you a measure of security that I don't think can be purchased off the shelf anymore. So I'm going to end quickly by quoting Dan Geer. So Dan Geer gave a talk at the NRO a few months ago. And anytime you get to hear Dan Geer talk, you should. But he made 2 points that were particularly interesting for me. He was going through trends in cybersec. And his trend 10 was basically that we have incredible complexity in the supply chain. And he basically said that security is non-composable, that you can get insecure results even if you're assembling secure components. And essentially he was saying, look, we're getting so complex with our supply chains that there's no way our supply chains can be secure anymore. And his 1012 basically said, look, we're growing, the industry is growing, and our body of knowledge is growing, but we're certainly expanding the attack surface faster than we're expanding our ranks. And the problem is just getting too big for us. He ends in a Dan Geer way that's quite typical of him, that leaves us all questioning. He basically says, there's so many questions, so few answers, such deep needs, such a shallow appreciation of the trend directions, that the greatest risk is the risk of simplistic solutions carried forward by charismatic fools. And this is kind of how I ended one of my blog posts last year, that basically said, what we left with are big, hairy problems. And if any vendors come through with simple solutions, it's probably a good indication that you should be showing him the door. We've got a list of all of the references and all of the links there. I want to thank you guys for your time. And if you guys have questions, you can hit them on the channel, or you can tweet them to us. So it's Harun Mir and Marcos Labiero. And if you're interested in this type of research, then you really should be signed up for Thinkscapes. Thanks for your time. And I guess that's over to you, Paul.
Okay, excellent job, Harun. It's really a little bit of a challenge to abbreviate the entire year in 40 minutes, but very well done. Next, we're going to hear from Amit Yoran, Senior Vice President, Unified Products with RSA, the Security Division of EMC. So, Amit, let me turn that over to you.
Okay, great. Let me get my presentation up here. There we go. And I want to thank Harun. I think did a great job of summing up 2013. I want to provide a little bit of visibility into the things we can expect in 2014. I especially liked his citing of Dan Geer. I thought it was a very well-written paper, and I love, as a former CEO of NetWitness and now running product engineering and product management for RSA, I love the fact that Dan cites NetWitness as an example of next-generation technology to give you the complete visibility into what's occurring in your environment and give you certainty and leveraging some big data concepts and some big data capabilities. So glad we don't fall into the latter category by any stretch, certainly by Dan Geer. I wanted to start off maybe first by providing a little bit of context to to my presentation on 2014, and that context is really first to look at the evolution of technology from the first generation platforms of mainframes, MIDI computers with terminal type applications to the second generation of computing platforms, the client-server architectures, the proliferation of PCs, and the changes to computing that really expanded to hundreds of millions of users and thousands of applications and network-based client-server architectures to what I think the modern computing platforms, this third generation, and this really started kind of in the 2007 era with the iPhone, but no doubt, billions of users of devices and millions to perhaps billions of applications all interacting with each other in ways and across networks and environments that no one could have anticipated years ago. And it's that evolution of technology and third generation platforms that provide us the modern computing flexibility that we appreciate. It also provides us the modern computing mess that we're trying to protect. It's one that's constantly evolving, where there are no perimeters, where access is entirely ubiquitous, and identities themselves need to be reimagined along with everything else. So the BYOD speaking trend is down, and I think that makes sense. It's very 2013 and 2012. Well, smartphones were really the start of IT consumerization. Right? People enjoy the BYOD, the flexibility that it provides. They demanded it, and organizations and enterprises resisted for a long time, but ultimately that wave overpowered them. And we've begun to learn how to secure and how to protect some subsets of devices and some architectures depending on your organization. But I believe this BYOD trend is going to evolve begin its evolution in 2014 to a bring your own identity. And the bring your own identity is with the realization that the identity and the complexity of identities across multiple devices and computing platforms and applications and cloud services and environments is going and has driven an increased complexity in the identity space. And this is creating all sorts of problems, not only for consumers, but for enterprises. They try and manage the modern computing platform. And like the BYOD challenges of years ago, we're going to see a mirroring of those pains into the information security profession. People are going to realize what the implications are and freak out a little bit about how they can protect their organizations. And we're going to continue to see this sort of exposure until we can really simplify the concept of identities in modern computing environments and not have to rely on users' good behavior in order to have the enterprise protected. As Haroon mentioned, the NSA disclosures which occurred during the course of the year, this is really fundamentally whether we characterize some subset of insider threat as the sysadmin problem. It certainly emphasized that, but it really emphasizes the security industry's dirty little secret, right, which for years we've known about the exposure and the damage which can occur from sysadmins and other insiders which have access, but a vast majority of the information security spend, time, energy, resources, and capability that exists out there does not address the insider threat challenges. And organizations which didn't take insider threat seriously after WikiLeaks got another wake-up call in 2013. So in 2014, we're going to see more attention paid to insider threat based on this much more visible, much deeper understanding of the impact insiders can have on brand, on revenues, on business continuity, on mission-critical factors for the organization to move forward. Now, also in light of some of the NSA disclosures, and also I think a point that Haroon touched on, right, a significant shift in how public cloud services are going to be deployed. Public cloud services for any type of organization domestically in the U.S. or internationally now require a greater level of strategic thinking about what enterprise compute requirements and data sets are going to go into the cloud, who has access to that information in transit or as it's being processed or stored in that cloud-based service. And we've seen and have heard, right, some European governments advocating for the balkanization of cloud services along national borders. This is going to be a trend in 2014, increased dialogue, increased visibility, and I think it has very serious implications not only for these nations and for the cloud service providers, but also for the potential balkanization of the internet itself. It's a concept that we've talked about from an internet governance perspective and thought through some of the implications from an internet governance perspective, but you know, this brings a new reality even above and beyond governance into cloud-based services and what this balkanization may require. And even in, and for those which adopt cloud services, the security of cloud services, which has largely been ignored for the most part, is going to become a key issue in 2014. I think 2014, maybe as a slight difference from Haroon's perspective, I think 2014 is going to be a tipping point for mobile activity in the security domain. We're already seeing an uptick in the past several months in the volume and ubiquity of mobile malware. Right? We used to use the Willie Sutton quote, right? When asked why he robs bank, he said, "That's where the money is." And we used to explain to people that the modern attacks are going after the enterprise's intellectual property, and that means attacking their networks, attacking their data stores, their digital assets. Well, I think we can say the same thing today about mobile. Given the ubiquity of mobile computing platforms, BYOD types of devices, the ubiquity of online commerce, and the cross-pollination of applications and use cases, the commingling of personal and business activities, online commerce, social media, and business applications, we think that mobile platforms are ripe for disruption in 2014, and we're going to see a significant increase of mobile malware, mobile exploits, and perhaps even high-profile activity occurring. Now, also, I think with Stuxnet perhaps as a harbinger not only of attacks against SCADA and a more complex orchestration of how a campaign can work against a specific target, I think we're going to see more activity against IP-enabled devices, perhaps expansion of what Haroon started to talk about with the attack on cars. We're seeing IP-enabled devices become, I won't say ubiquitous yet, but fairly prevalent outside of traditional general-purpose computing environments. We're seeing and we're enjoying the convenience and efficiency that is offered by IP-enabled and network-enabled technology, but that's not coming without a cost. And in this case, coming with the increased risk. So the risk of device access, modification, or perhaps even systemic abuse in the non-traditional technology environments is ripe for disruption in 2014. Perhaps we'll see some high-profile types of activities happening there. We've all seen the demos of access to cars and other devices in the home, but we're at a point where some destructive, high-profile attacks are certainly possible. So the at RSA, providing a series of technologies, whether NetWitness and on the network monitoring side, the ingest of log data, to really provide accurate visibility so that you can truly identify what's occurring, because relying on those traditional data sources, the metadata coming in and the alerts which come in from systems which are structured and organized to only understand attack patterns is going to be insufficient to identify the more creative attacks, the original exploits, the attacks which more and more skilled adversaries, and perhaps the skill level may even be dropping the threshold, the skill requirement dropping in order to have more sophisticated zero-day exploits. And so providing visibility and certainty into what's actually occurring, and then better and more powerful analytics in order to detect these new methods of exploitation, enabling organizations to move faster in today's in light of today's threat environment. So appreciate your time and look forward to answering questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, Amit. We do have a couple minutes. We're going to extend our time for our Q&A. And let's see, we have at least a couple of questions here. But Haroon, did you saw a question here from, let's see, was it Tom who wanted to know
Tom
something?
Larson. Yeah.
Yes.
So Tom asks, do you think the top 20 controls evangelized by SANS is a collection of simplistic solutions? And I don't want to be too horrible about it. So at best, what I think I'd say is that I think that they require a great deal of customization for individual organizations. And I think at best, most of them would be necessary but not sufficient. Like I say, increasingly, I like the approach that we're seeing from guys like Etsy and guys like Facebook, who basically are coming to the realization that says a good sysadmin is worth his weight in gold. And to take the answer slightly longer, you've started to see over the past few years the value that a good sysadmin who understands security and understands sysadmining can bring just in terms of security to the network is many times more than the checklists that we've been going through for a while. Some of it is common sense, and some of it is just work that needs to be done. But nothing against SANS or their top 20 in particular. I think some of it's good stuff. But certainly I think if you just did those things, you'd still have holes in your organization just because that stuff needs customization for your environment. We had another question. Somebody asked what was the time frame for the Nmap corruption. And that stuff was published. Nmap put it out to the list early in April. So around April 17th. That's when that stuff happened. But I guess in general terms, it's probably a good reminder for people just to be questioning when they're downloading software in general, just to make sure that they're actually checking signatures and that the signatures are not hosted on the exact same site that they're pulling their downloads from for almost exactly that reason.
Okay, thanks. And maybe timely here, we just have a few moments, but if either of you wanted to just speak quickly to the target breach just announced yesterday, maybe each want to have a quick comment, and then we can wrap it up.
I would say Haroon hit the nail on the head earlier when he said that if you aren't well versed in incident response, and if you don't have people who spend their entire time, day in, day out, practicing this, working it, responding to incidents, the time to execute in your own incident and the time to learn this is not when you're undergoing that incident. And so, having spent more than a decade in working through and leading incident response teams, I would say, in a similar vein, the initial comment, the initial feedback on any incident, whether it's a Snowden type of situation or any other incident, the initial reports typically have plenty of flaws, plenty of conjecture, and until we get down to and have a good understanding of what the ultimate facts are, it's difficult to comment.
Yeah, there's not a lot more to say on that. I think one of the things, again, just I'll quote Dan Gear because he's eminently quotable. One of the things that he spoke a lot about in his cyber trends talk was the increasing divide. And it cuts across multiple spheres, one of them being the increasing divide between people who actually know how bad off their current security posture is and the absolute tip of the spear in terms of attacker capabilities. And I think it's kind of sad because most guys who actually have really valuable stuff to defend, like treasure troves full of credit card data, in many cases don't know how vulnerable they are. And I'm not saying it to be alarmist, I'm saying it because the gap right now is really massive. And I think over over the last year, more than anything, what we've seen is a dose of reality. I'm sure Sony thought they were protected until they managed to get taken down by lulsec and teenagers. And I'm sure lots of the organizations who got taken down were not complete idiots. They were spending money on Infosec and spending money on firewalls and defenses. There was just misallocated spend. And some of that is a bitter pill to swallow. But I think if 2013, 2012 taught us anything, it's that we're all in that space just hoping those attacks don't come on our watch.
Great. Excellent point. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have left. For more information, you can sign up or refer to any of the links that are here before you, and also look for the next Black Hat webcast towards the end of January. Look on our website, or we'll also send you an invitation. And thanks for attending today's Black Hat webinar, 2013, the Infosec Year in Review, brought to you by Black Hat, RSA, and United Business Media, LLC. Shortly after this live event, we'll send you an email to access this presentation on demand. This webcast is copyright 2013 by United Business Media, LLC. Presentation materials are owned by or copyright, if that is the case, by Black Hat, RSA, and United Business Media, or are solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. And on behalf of our expert guests, Haroon Mir, founder of Thinkst, and our sponsor presenter, Amit Yoran, Senior Vice President, Unified Products with RSA, the Security Division of EMC, we want to thank you for your time. Happy holidays, and have a great day.